Gail Boyle is our last talk before a quick break, and she'll be addressing one of the other major wings of the REMADE project, which is working within the museum environment. Thank you.
I'm trying to see over the top of the lectern. I might need a kick step, but there we go. Sorry for being short. We've just heard about some wonderful scientific techniques. I'm going to bring us down a little bit to earth now and talk about the reality of our world. I could have called this always on the receiving end, because either we are on the receiving end of all that material, all of that data, but we're also on the receiving end of all of those requests to access that information that we've already got. So I'm just going to do it from our perspective. So when we get these kinds of requests in to access material of any different kinds, obviously, have you done your homework before you even come to us? Do you know if we've got it? I cannot begin to tell you the number of requests that we get for, do you happen to have any of these things? I haven't got time to go researching on behalf of somebody else whether I've got these things. I kind of hope that you might have done some homework in the first place. And then when we first started talking about the REMADE project, the first thing I said to Pete on the phone was, oh, thank you for coming to us before you kind of framed what you were going to do. Because that's the other thing that tends to happen. We are always having to be reactive. We don't have £4.5 million to go and dig anywhere. We don't have 4.5p to do anything generally. And so if we can be involved right at the very beginning, what that means is that any research project, scientific or any other kind of research project that comes to us, it can be made relevant to us and we can enable it better together if we do it right from the outset. But on the whole, the vast majority of research projects that come to us have already been framed before they get there. And then are you asking the questions that we want to know the answers to? So where do those questions come from? And you'll see, like, we are very public focused, we are audience focused. I often sit there and think, do any of these answers that you're coming up with mean anything to the person who lives next door to me? So does my next door neighbour have any interest whatsoever in knowing what you are researching, and how do I make it relevant to them? Because we are the public face of this. And I know that tomorrow we've got some discussion sessions that are about that. And then the timescales. So the timescales that are involved for doing things. And I'll show you a little slide a bit further on about the timescale of one project that we've been involved with. So then I've got lost in translation. Do we speak the same language? So those research questions are often written in scientific terminology versus plain English. Frances talked about her subject matter. She said she wasn't an archaeological scientist. I'm not an archaeological scientist either. But I have to read some of those questions that come in. We have sampling requests that comes in. So do I even understand that? And then there are assumptions about what we know about those analytical techniques, what we know has already been used and what we have experienced. And obviously those analytical techniques are changing literally virtually every month sometimes. So what I might have known last year might not actually be relevant this year. And where can I get the information from in order to find out if that is a valid technique to even use? And then what are the projected benefits? I said for the museum, for the public. So if we're going to invest our time in providing this, which is part of our role, we are facilitators and enablers, how do I ensure that there is public benefit to what we are doing beyond those benefits to the archaeological world, which tend to be quite closed and not open? So I just thought I'd give you an example. This is a part of a research request that came in. It's actually for some lead isotope analysis. And I started to look at this primarily because it was going to inform one of the other slides that I was going to show you. So this is about analysis of lead ingots, lead pigs that we have in our collection. One which is a Vespasian pig, one which is an Antonius pig. And these were a group of German scientists who were asking if they could have access to that and to drill holes into the bottom of them. And I looked at that and thought, well, I have no idea what that means, actually. What it really means is they want to drill holes in the bottom, use some really, really neat gear to tell me where the lead might have come from. But actually, it's written like that. And to me, I understood that. I have no idea what a 1.8 millimeter sapphire injector in triple detector mode actually means. It's kind of like it just all washes over. So you can't assume that we actually know what these things do. But that is one example of the kind of thing. And that matters because to some of us, we've been on the receiving ends of these kinds of research questions for a long time, and we are archaeologists. But the vast majority of people that work in museums that are looking after collections are not. And we know that because SMA did a whole load of survey work. So you can see just there, only 33% of museums with responsibility for the care of archaeological archives, because that's what we're asking about, they dropped by 33%. And that is a worsening situation. So that's been happening because of austerity primarily. The vast majority of museums that care for that kind of material are provided by local authorities. And clearly local authorities do not provide museums on a statutory footing at all. So that means we're easy to cut. Only half, less than half, employ a curator with any specialist expertise at all. And by specialist expertise, we were measuring against the matrix of competence that we'd drawn up for the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists and where that level of professional practice is. And most have fewer than 1.5 full-time equivalents on average dealing with that archaeological material, and generally fewer than one. So it might only be a part-time. So it's the resource. And, we need to understand that those people who are not specialists also need to understand how. These are just some of the qualitative results that came from the Southwest region. And you can see that we do have to rely quite a lot on people that are already retired, that have gone away. You hold the knowledge. And so I know that there is a research project at the moment, I think it's UCL that's doing it, to do about the flow of knowledge out of museums, for example, and that is exactly what's happening. And we need to actually gather all of that once we've lost it to people who are retiring, who have gone on to different careers. And then I thought I'd talk about unrealistic expectations and an exceptional resource. So I asked our conservator whether she could think of any museums that could match the British Museum in terms of what it could provide to researchers that would go in. And the answer was there isn't anywhere. There isn't any regional museum that can do this. So on the left-hand side, that is a direct quote from all the research section of the British Museum website, world-class laboratory facilities. And the reality on the right-hand side, actually, that's Naomi Rubinstein. I actually asked her to do a PXRF on an Egyptian dagger when she was really doing stuff on my coins that she wanted to for hers. The reality was, and Pete will know this because he worked on the same desk, so we have a spare desk in our office. So the reality is most of us do not, and we cannot provide a laboratory resource. And then where the stuff is kept. So obviously we've been collecting material in Bristol for the best part of 200 years. We don't have space in the main building. Quite a lot of us are using stores off-site. So when you request material, that means we need a really quite long lead-in time to be able to even withdraw it. So it's where it is and how it's stored. And then obviously documentation standards of what we've got vary. They're not all digitized. We have huge amounts of paperwork, and they are better post PPG 16 because we started to introduce standards by which people were depositing and also documenting the material. It saves us a lot of time. And so anything after 1990 is pretty good. But if you're going to look for stuff before 1990, documentation is probably still in brown envelopes in somebody's filing cabinet that is not digitized and therefore not globally searchable. And then if you've got stuff that's out of sight, you've got transport and logistics to deal with. Do we have a vehicle? No. Does it rely on many of us going out in our own personal cars to fetch things back so that you can have the? Yes. And then we've got to get there, get back, and do all of that. And I'm just going to show you a slide in a minute. And then if you want to take stuff away, that is an absolute nightmare because we have to change all of our documentation. We have to go through our registrar. Oh, no, we don't have one of those anymore because they've just been made redundant. So we have to go through all the loan aspect of it. What's the insurance? What's the security? And then we're going to have to charge you to take it to wherever you want to because we don't have any funding to supply that. So I was chatting to Angie about this. And she said, oh, I put together a little case study about one inquiry that we had, which was relative to cat, fox, hawks and pigeon bones. And I think we were on the receiving end of the pigeon bones aspect of it as well. And she worked out there were 9 separate pre-1990s archive sites held in an external store. There were 290 boxes worth of material that had to be manually sorted to fish out the cat, the fox, the hawk, and the pigeon bones, as long as they were identified. And she worked out, including her time going to and from, just to get that material out, was a cost of nearly £1,200 just to do that. And obviously, it's not the only thing that we do, and we have to justify what we do to lots of people. And then we get to the destructive versus the non-destructive. So there are lots of people that will be really reticent about drilling holes into things. And the curator's default position is always going to be do the least harm. So what can you find out without destructive analysis in the first place? Which is why it's really useful when people are looking at PXRF and drilling to find out what the relative benefits are of actually doing that destructive analysis. And because we put things on display as well, we want to make sure that wherever is drilled, it's not going to make a difference to what it looks like when somebody sees it on display, unless we're telling the story of that analysis itself. If we've got huge numbers of coins, which we have, I think the vast majority of requests I've had recently are all to do with large coin hoards. So when Naomi wanted to drill holes into the side of some of our 11,500 coins from one hoard, that wasn't a problem because we've got lots of them. And I am of the opinion that there's very little point in us having all this in our store if people cannot ask questions that we want to know the answers to and have access to it. And then obviously I've already mentioned that we need to reassure that the techniques are state of the art, are what is being asked to be done the way that it should be done now. So just going back to that little description of what these German scientists wanted to do, that's the bottom one, the request for sampling for corpus of Roman lead ingots. That request came in 2012. I chased it in 2017. I chased it last week to find out when that corpus was actually going to be published. It's not due until 2024. They gave me the information that was going to go in the corpus when I said I still haven't had this information back. And they only told me what I already knew, which is what it said on the top of the. And then so I had to go chasing then around the world to find the scientist who had moved from the organisation. So over that 12-year period, they're no longer working in the same institutions as they were before. And I got a little message back literally yesterday morning to give me the results of the lead isotope analysis of these two pigs. And so far, all I know is what I pretty much knew before, is that that lead was likely to have come from Mendip, which is literally just down the road from where we are. What I don't know yet, and the question is, how far did that lead travel across the empire? Because that's what I want to know. I don't know the answer to that yet. And the reason I showed this is, I'm not sure if you can actually see just there's a whacking great big hole that's been drilled. That wasn't the German scientists. I'm assuming that that was done in either 1928, then added to in 1935. The details of the results from that analysis are on paper in a history file. And I've fished those out. They're not actually attached to the object record. And like I said, that size, I mean, it's literally the size of, I don't know, 2p piece and deep, as opposed to, you can see the three little holes, which actually the ones that the German scientists drilled and took the material away from them. If it's a massive amount of material on a big object on the bottom, it's not going to show too much. So we need to encourage and make people more confident, particularly as curators who are not archaeologists, that that's an okay thing to do relative to what that object is. If that's an object where I've only got one particular, if there's only one of those in the entire world, then we're going to have to think twice about what we would enable and how we make people confident in those decisions in order to enable them. And then, Pete, you came and did some PXRF for me. That was actually a proactive piece of research that I wanted to do because I wanted to know the answer to whether our material in an antiquarian collection, which purported to be from Lauristan, was fake or real based on a metallurgical analysis. But what he gave to me was, obviously, Pete came along, did all of this PXRF to start off with. That's just a little extract of it. I can't put that on display in a museum. That is not something that any member of the public is going to understand, let alone a curator. Any of those graphs that you've already seen on any of the previous presentations are never going to go on the wall of my gallery. And that's the challenge that we face. We have to translate this into pretty much top line messages that mean something. And in the one of the previous questions was to do with Sam's work and the data about the coins, and how that might relate to material culture. Museums have to see it as a whole. One story about some coins is probably not enough for us. We need to put that into a much wider context. And so that means we need to have access to that information in a format that we can understand, generally for free. So if I go shooting around the internet to look for this kind of like answer, paywall, can't get in. Not an academic institution, don't have a subscription. How do I get that information? And those, the platforms that they're in, what's the most up to date? Because it's really confusing to get those answers. So that's one of the challenges I know that we're going to be discussing tomorrow. But one of the things that we can do from a museum perspective is to publish a research charter. So SMA did do a funded project, which was funded by Arts Council, whereby we went and reviewed all of our standards and guidance about the management of archaeological collections. And one of those is obviously about making them available for research. It's how we use the collections. So this is what it says. This is one of the top line things. Is we are advising that all museums should publish some kind of research charter on their website, which says what they can do for you, and also what they might need from you in return, in order to be able to facilitate that research process. And that includes all of the things that we might have questions that we want to know the answers to, as opposed to the questions that you might want to know the answers to. And equally, and this is one of my biggest bugbears, the regional research frameworks. And the regional research frameworks do not pay enough reference to stored museum collections. That is why people do not come to ask us questions. It is much easier when Alex was talking about a new site which has funding for that scientific research to take place, because the funding exists. If we want funding in order to be able to look at all of that stored resource, it has to be written into a research framework somewhere that poses those questions. And sadly, only even one of the new ones that I've looked at even references a museum collection, and that's a thematic one to do with the Mesolithic, and it says something like museums need to be better at telling us what they've got, which is kind of not what we're talking about. And then the other thing, as far as these standards were concerned, is we started to produce little fact sheets, and mainly to look about storage, care, display, etc., of different kinds of materials. And what we need are the same kind of things about techniques in order for those to be able to be disseminated. And then just very finally, because this is about us collaborating and speaking to each other on similar terms, in 2015, I started to think about how even subject specialist networks within the museum world had started to, well, there was no level of communication at all. We couldn't share information about where museums were under threat even, and how did we talk to each other, and also how did we support each other to provide that information. So the long and the short of it is we ended up setting up this thing called the Subject Specialist Network Consortium. It is not anything that you pay but to belong to. You have a web presence, you can say what you do. There's no scientific presence in that consortium. We've got 50 different groups. Historical Metallurgy Society would be an SSN that we could provide access to through that portal. So where is the SSN for archaeometallurgy and museums? And should this project, REMADE, be the birth of an SSN that enables that process? Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Really important to look at the practicalities of doing this type of collaborative work. Before we have a break, any questions, please?
There'd be this audience that deposit back to the museum once you've sampled up these, because, and this is where commercial units are very good. We get that whole archive, but for yourselves, we as curators of the museums will be standing on your shoulders at this moment in time, as Gail said, tell the stories. But we need more than your final report, that sort of raw data, because in 200 years' time, the future yourselves will be standing on your shoulders you won't be retired then to go and ask. So with all your information and raw data will be found in our archives, and that's where the future research is now. So anyway, that's my plea. It's like an amazing, exciting opportunity for us all, but also for museum collections. But we need to just round the circle, so everything that you do, if you then bring back to the museums that you worked with, it's just brilliant, and then we can keep doing. But yeah, great, Gail, brilliant talk. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an idea, I think, based on one of your ideas that with the SMART project, you found videos worked really well, especially because people don't always have time. And I was thinking if REMADE could make videos explaining the techniques for the public, that's also audiovisual content we can put on our websites and in our galleries. And it's a way of them bringing science to different areas of curriculum and things like that. I think Wendy Matthews with Chapel Hoyt featured in one in Minneapolis that did a similar kind of thing that made it a kind of science and technology focus. So something like that could be an interesting approach.
So there was one thing I did think about, which was probably a step too far for this conference, but I thought about what those questions were that we might want to know the answers to. And then I thought, why aren't we co-creating research questions with members of the public? Because that is the biggest thing that's in museums at the moment. We don't have all the answers. We shouldn't be just formulating the questions. We should be responding to what they want to know. But that's another subject entirely.
I mean, the project is bringing grants money for better online material, and it wants to invest in finding out the right questions in consultancy and reaching better audiences. And we're very lucky because we have this breadth of funding that we can have cycles of that, and we can have a public talk. And I think the SSN is a brilliant idea. And tomorrow, we've got 5 minutes tomorrow. Hopefully, we can get into much more pragmatics about what to do. Obviously, we have Justine Bailey from Stockholm Talent Society, who's done the great work on online resources already, and how we can build on those and keep talking. Basically, is the real. Sorry.
I just want to say as well that having these sheets that explain techniques save you as a scientist a lot of time, because I've made some for work I did with the Archaeology Museum, which is lucky in its amount of curatorial staff, but similarly they're experts in their area, they're not experts in the science, and you get the same question a million times about, you know, how can I do this, what does this technique do? And if you have these list of sheets that they can look at with some case studies, it just makes they come to you informed, and you go to them with something to give them, and you just start in such a better place for conversations.
Again, I mean, a comment rather than a question for you specifically, but if you go and look on the Historical Metallurgy Society's website,
yeah,
there is the research framework that we produced for metallurgy, which was aimed at archaeologists and museum staff, so it's not all the million-one details.
Yeah.
And there are a whole lot of data sheets that we produced, some of them as far back as the 1990s.
So I know that because I'm an archaeologist, and I would know the Historical Metallurgy Society exists. But historical metallurgy is not just going to be relevant to archaeology, is it? No. So all my friends in social history will want to know that that exists, and they won't know that because it's not signposted to them directly.
Well, I mean, we're doing our best. I would say
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Now freely available, free download, you don't have to pay.
Yeah.
And lots of articles, not only
is the historical metal to actually just be part of this, because it's literally you have a web page, you control the web page, you put the information on there. But if we're advising people to go and get information, we'll just say you can find a subject matter, and that's the portal that it's a one-stop shop. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think I just said some people are trying to make stuff,
Yes, yeah,
you know, 20, 30 years ago.
yeah,
The information is still around for free if anyone wants to look.
yeah. Right.